Welcome to DC Insiders, where we bring you sharp views about global issues with relevance to Taiwan from the political capital of the world here in Washington, D.C. I'm your host, Wenchi Yu.
我国国防预算将达到3.32%，占 GDP 的3.32%。那我们也渴望在2030年之前，比照北约的标准，达到 GDP 的1%。
Taiwan's President Lai Ching-te recently pledged to spend up to 5% of its GDP on defense by 2030, with an increase to 3.3% in its defense spend next year. The U.S. has consistently provided defensive arms to Taiwan since the 1979 Taiwan Relations Act, but sales have evolved significantly over time. In recent years, sales have focused on building Taiwan's asymmetric defense capabilities, smaller, more mobile systems designed to inflict significant damage on a larger invading force rather than on large-scale, expensive platforms. How does the United States provide military assistance to its allies and friends to help build up its global defense, including its non-diplomatic ally, Taiwan, as well as major recipients such as Israel and Ukraine? We're speaking to Clark Cooper, former Assistant Secretary for Political Military Affairs at the U.S. Department of State during the first Trump administration. Welcome, Clark.
Thank you, Wenchi. Pleasure to be here.
Trump's reported denial of military aid to Taiwan has fueled concerns about a possible U.S. policy shift. This comes at a time when he has yet to authorize any arms sales packages to Taiwan during his second term.
During the Trump administration, that $18.6 billion arms sales was, delivered to Taiwan. And what is your view on this potential change of policy?
We've already referenced the 1979 Taiwan Relations Act. That is the ironclad foundation of United States relationship with Taiwan and the whole basis for arms sales and defense tech transfers to Taipei from Washington. So if we look at it more of I would say like a tactical recalibration versus a policy shift or a strategic shift. The key word here is, if the reporting is true or accurate, it's more of a reflection of a pause. It's not a cessation. And as you mentioned, the 18.6 billion, yes, when I was Assistant Secretary of State, that was the record amount of arms sales to Taipei ever. And that said, there's not a slowing down. I mean, there's a backlog on deliveries, yes. But I would say I would look at this more of a tactical recalibration. I wouldn't say it's a wholesale shift in policy or strategic shift, because again, I go back to that ironclad foundation of the Taiwan Relations Act.
So I like what you were saying about being tactical. So it sounds like this long policy hasn't really changed. But if you can just help us understand sort of how does it really work, right? I understand it's a pretty bureaucratic process that most people probably don't understand how it's approved, how it's delivered, and how long it would take.
Right. Well, you mentioned one piece already. You talked about presidential prerogatives, right? You mentioned this pause. Well, it's much more than that, right? So there's interagency processes. Congress has a significant role when it comes to arms transfers and sales.
Does the Congress have to approve every single deal, or?
No, I mean, there's thresholds, and we won't go through all the different thresholds, but there's a statutory framework for this. There's the Arms Export Control Act. That act is just a little bit older than the Taiwan Relations Act. So we're talking about a piece of legislation that is almost 50 years old, barely amended. Many, including myself, feel like it could be updated and amended. The current administration is actually taking effort to do that. But what it does mean is it provides that statutory framework where the Department of State has the lead. And there are two general channels, and Taiwan takes advantage of both. One is FMS, foreign military sales, and that is a government-to-government sales process. And the other one is then DCS, direct commercial sales, and that is the entity like a prime or a contract that would go straight to the customer. Generally different tracks. Some have different advantages than others. FMS advantages is if there's a concern or a question, it's immediately rectified by the central government. However, DCS in general can be a little bit more expedient because it's a direct sale from the commercial entity say to the
But it
government.
still requires government approval, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But in all of that, as I said, you have three general categories. You have these interagency reviews that take place, that presidential prerogative that we started the conversation with, and then Congress has a heavy role. What's in Taiwan's interest is that they're very unique in that across administrations since 1979, they have really solid support across the aisle. And it is highly unusual, especially in this era in the United States, for our country to enjoy and benefit from both parties who are hands clasped essentially in support of Taiwan's defense. I would add though on the interagency processes is again, state is that lead, but it reflects elements of the intelligence community, of course the Defense Department, which is the implementer, but it does go into, when we look at the giant fulcrum of what's taking place and the year's planning. So if we go to the bilateral aspect, when we talk about, is this supposed reported pause a real pause, it takes years of planning. Years of planning, and this is Washington, Taipei planning together. And of course, immediate neighbors that are paying attention to this are Japan and Australia, place close attention from Indo-Pacific regions as to how that planning process is going. But in a very brief nutshell, that is what it is.
Yeah, I'm sure it's a very long and very carefully thought out process. And so, unfortunately, in recent years, there's been reporting about how Taiwan's defense modernization efforts have been hampered by an extensive backlog of U.S. arms sales awaiting delivery. So, for example, right, in December 2024, the backlog was estimated at nearly $22 billion. And of course, there are reasons for that. People say the war in Ukraine, as well as just the bottleneck in the defense system, in the industry, are actually the two major causes. And then, at least in Taiwan, it got a lot of attention, which was a report by the U.S. Department of Defense Inspector General also found that some of the previously delivered equipment was unserviceable, undermining confidence in the delivery process. So what is going on? Like, can these issues be addressed since Taiwan has paid so much money to acquire the...
Certainly there's a shared concern about the backlog. So I would say it's fair to assess that it's not just Taipei that's concerned. As I said, there are members of Congress on committees of jurisdiction that have noted this. You cited the IG's report, the Inspector General's report from the Pentagon. So there's a domestic concern here as well. And yes, one, if looks at it in a general assessment, there are probably two big categories that impact this. You mentioned the war in Ukraine. That has taken a lot of bandwidth and resources for that sustainment. On top of that, even before February 2022, the United States Defense Industrial Base was certainly already at a need or a posture to be improved and expanded. Couple that with the war in Ukraine, you have a defense industrial base that needs to be bolstered, grown, and then you also have the sustainment line. Those are two very contributing factors. But what can you do? So there's already efforts to strengthen the industrial base. We've seen this in a number of executive orders, some steps that were cited in executive orders. Another one is reform of the processes.
Yeah.
Foreign military sales. If one looks closely at President Trump's executive order on FMS reform, that is a capture of what was identified during President Trump's first term. So myself, as Assistant Secretary of State, then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, he and I understood where there were roadblocks globally, right? Not just Taiwan.
Yeah.
And as I mentioned, the Arms Export Control Act is from the mid-1970s. This is a 50-year-old piece of legislation, very important statute, but it hasn't caught up with the time. So I would look at it from having been in the seat and looking at where things are now, not just fixing our industrial base or bolstering it, but there's some legislative reform that could occur on the Arms Export Control Act, getting the FMS processes in a more expedited fashion so cases can move with alacrity, allowing some flexibility. And then enhancing sustainment and maintenance. This touches a little bit on the IG report, and this also touches on individual cases where there could be what some like to colloquially call the total package approach. Look at that a little closer on the maintenance and sustainment aspect specific to Taiwan cases. And then there's also something that has been brought up by Taipei in a number of dialogues, including when I was in a ministerial capacity, is looking at how to better leverage some co-production and regional partnerships. I already mentioned the Indo-Pacific, I mentioned Japan, and I mentioned Australia, South Korea. Those are some considerations that are already on the table.
Since you already mentioned this co-production possibility, right? So Senator Roger Wicker, who is the current chair of Senate Armed Services Committee, recently just visited Taiwan. It was a big deal, and he also talked about the possibility of Taiwan and the U.S. joint production of weapons. What would it look like? And another question is, some people do wonder, with the efforts of building up Taiwan's defense system, is it more about deterrence, or is it going to be a provocation to China?
It's not just deterrence, it's also resiliency, right? So this is building deeper and greater capacities. And so one of the foreign policy intents of defense trade or defense sales or tech transfer is not only shared interest and reciprocities in defense and shared interest, but it's also building the capacity of allies and partners for themselves. And you mentioned it earlier about the asymmetric focus. And I look back to when I was in my ministerial capacity we were having very candid conversations with Taipei about don't entirely focus on the big ticket items like the F-35, like submarines. You do need to look at asymmetric capabilities for your resilience. And so I would say when we look at co-production and some more domestic research and development, it is about deterrence, but it's also about resilience as well.
So one of your roles, right, when you were Assistant Secretary at the Department of State, of course, people usually think about defense, think about it's the Pentagon's thing. But I think the U.S. has provided a lot of military assistance that's beyond just weapons. That includes personnel training. It's been interesting to see that the U.S. has come out more openly about having permanent military personnel based in Taiwan helping with the training. This is unprecedented. I mean, since 1979, basically. So what does all that mean, right? There's a lot of sort of alarming messages coming from Beijing saying, this is literally crossing the red line. What is your view?
Well, for starters, it's not. And if anything, being a former bureaucrat, I'm going to say we're going to point back to statute to policy. And so actually having advisors on the ground is well within the 1979 framework of the Taiwan Relations Act. It also falls into the scope of the 6 assurances. What it does do is provide advisory capacity. So I already talked about...
But it is like 500 soldiers.
But they're not combat troops.
Okay, that's important.
Right, and so this is where Beijing's trying to align it or identify it as provocation. It's not. If anything, it goes back to capacity building, bolstering capabilities, and this also kind of goes back to the total package approach of FMS. Other allies and partners globally in different parts of the world have something similar to this because this actually ensures greater efficacy of the kit that's being purchased. Better to have a train the trainer kind of scenario. But as I said, it not only enhances readiness for Taiwan, it enhances interoperability between the United States and Taiwan. Again, regionally, if you're sitting in Australia, Japan, or South Korea, that also helps build on those regional interoperabilities and communications as well. But going back to bureaucratic nuance, it's in the framework of the statute, it's in the framework of long-held policy. Sure, is it uncomfortable with Beijing to know that there's several hundred U.S. troops in Taipei, but they know the difference. They know these are advisors, not combatants. 500
advisors is quite a few. But we also want to talk about Ukraine because Taiwanese care a lot of what is happening to Ukraine. They almost look at it as like a sisterhood, brotherhood kind of situation. However, there's been, growing concern that somehow it's an either-or situation. Either, especially in Washington D.C., either you pay more attention to Ukraine or you pay more attention back to the Indo-Pacific region, which is related to China and Taiwan. And we saw that, as we discussed previously, in terms of the weapons delivery. That's one cause to the delayed delivery to Taiwan as well. How the U.S. military assistance to Ukraine has evolved, and what are some of the lessons that can be learned for Taiwan?
Well, so if you go back to 2022, President Biden's in office, and he rightly did a presidential drawdown authority. So he used, again, prerogative and statutory authority to immediately assist. Even that administration knew that wasn't sustainable. So it's no surprise during transition from the Biden administration to Trump's second administration that there was already a shift, or as you said, an evolution in how sustainment was being addressed for Ukraine. It also highlighted the defense industrial base issue here.
Can you say more about the drawdown authority? How is that different from the traditional arms sales?
So there are arms sales happening. So FMS and DCS do apply in Ukraine, but the PDA, or the Presidential Drawdown Authority, is actually taking, and it's an emergency, it's not a long term, it's taking from US stocks, right? So that's what makes it unique, but that's where we've evolved past
that's
from
more
that.
Like an emergency situation.
It is, and it's been done, many presidents have briefly touched it, and it's because arms are not, and I hate to use this example, but arms are not like going to a shoe store. You and I can walk down onto Connecticut Avenue and go into different shoe stores and ask for something to be pulled off the shelf. Arms are made to order. They're just not sitting around. So an emergency drawdown is necessary if there's an immediate need. Ukraine at the time could have said, we need XYZ arms, and the Biden administration could have said, yep, we will expedite those orders, but they don't exist until they're made or they're ordered.
Yeah.
So a drawdown means you're taking something that's already in existing stock. The evolution is now Ukraine is purchasing, either through FMS or DCS, capabilities, but it's what anybody else would recognize on the planet as, in they're putting an order in, it's a purchase that's being ordered and manufactured to order.
And so in the case of Taiwan, it hasn't touched on the drawdown yet, right?
No.
Okay.
No.
Yeah.
No. And again, the emergency drawdown is just that. It is highly unusual and
Yeah.
not a common vehicle.
And then we also want to talk about Israel, because it is the largest recipient of U.S. military aid. So help Taiwan's audience understand, why is helping Israel defense so important to America?
So many of these MOUs between the United States and Israel are rooted in building up defense capabilities to counter Soviet presence in the Middle East. And that may seem odd today when we're looking at, we've just gone through 20 years of GWOT, Global War on Terrorism, and counterterrorism. We've had several decades of some of those terror prosecutions being directly aligned with the regime in Tehran. But the roots of U.S.-Israel bilateral defense cooperation go back to the Soviet era. And there are multiple MOUs. One thing that I think is fascinatingly similar to Jerusalem and Taipei is the long-term planning. So the United States and Taipei do years out planning, looking forward, and Washington and Jerusalem do similarly long-term planning, years looking out forward on capacities, requirements, areas to evolve or improve. One particular MOU that I particularly find fascinating, 1983, Reagan administration created this entity called the JPMG. It's the Joint Political Military Group. It meets annually, sometimes biannually. The U.S. seat is the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Political Military Affairs, and then my counterpart sitting in Israel. That is how capabilities and requirements are identified, measured, reviewed, assessed, and has been doing that since 1983. Now, the need for that evolved. As I mentioned, we talk about Iran being a direct threat, to an existential threat to Israel. But when the JPMG was founded in 1983, my predecessor was looking at it from a counter-Soviet perspective.
Yeah. We wanted to understand, how does the U.S. think about Taiwan having its own defense industry rather than being reliant on just U.S. sales?
Yeah, well, so you already mentioned the increase. So if we're looking forward, I mean, we're about to enter a new fiscal year very soon. So if we look at fiscal year 2026, we're talking about a $1 trillion rise in defense authorization, and that's a huge infusion not only of resources, but it also gets into looking at next generation capabilities, air, sea, land, cyber capabilities. But it also does go to your point about building capacity and resiliency in Taiwan. I would say, one thing, not to get ahead of U.S. Policy here on this, but long-term thinking has been, it's not just the Chinese People's Republic Army or the PLA. It's not just the People's Liberation Army. It's also looking at what Taiwan can only do for itself, but in a regional role, and global commitments that we may share. I mean, I mentioned the Soviet Union earlier when I was talking about Israel, right? Moscow's still a problem. Russia is still a shared problem and concern globally. So I would look from that perspective of, if we're looking at next generation capabilities, that R&D, that research, that engineering, that research development engineering doesn't all have to reside in one place. You and I know this from other dialogues and conversations, that there are pockets of indispensability that can contribute to interoperability, and Taiwan could occupy that space.
Another thing I want to ask you about is, with the current Trump administration, we're seeing a growing trend, the MAGA wing of the Republican Party, that calls for a more restrained U.S. role in foreign intervention. Have you observed any change in terms of just how the U.S. is positioning itself in the world?
Well, there's more than one MAGA flank. So to really get it complicated, and I won't go through all the different nuances or varying shades of MAGA, but I think it is fair to say that, yes, there's a recalibration of tone, right? So if one looks at it from an American first perspective by those who identify in that space, compared to, again, if we're generalizing two camps, right, MAGA and conventional conservative, there's not a retreat, though. So I go back to, we still have the core tenets or statutory framework and policy. Taiwan Relations Act is still there. Six Assurance is still there. The bipartisan commitment toward Taiwan's self-defense capability and its ability to also be a regional actor. So tone, sure, there's a tone. And yes, are there going to be some elements inside those ranks that are maybe more of an isolationist aspect? Some of them would say they're not. But I would offer that even before President Trump, there were a handful of elected Republicans who did not like the idea of foreign military sales being a significant implement of foreign policy. And without name checking those members, I'd say it's really more of a tonal thing versus a retreat or a change.
Yeah, so it sounds like there's not a real policy change yet, but a lot of the news stories that our Taiwanese audience is watching, sometimes is more tactical, it's timing, and potentially, as you said, rhetorical and tonal kind of changes.
Well, but so let's look at some tangibles, right? So if we open the aperture beyond Taiwan, treaty alliances are still in place. NATO Article 5 commitments are still in place. In fact, the president actually, in that lengthy General Assembly speech yesterday, the president specifically cited NATO commitments. Did take one for the win about the GDP rise on defense spending.
At the NATO summit in June, virtually all NATO members formally committed to increase defense spending, at my request, from 2% to 5% of GDP, making our alliance far stronger and more powerful than it was ever before.
But it was also an affirmation of that treaty. So the Washington Treaty was affirmed, still is in place. But that also includes defense pacts and alliances that we have in Asia as well. Those are still there. Forward presence. One of the less known things that I got to do as Assistant Secretary of State was to review and approve FONOPS, freedom of navigation operations, of naval movements through the Taiwan Strait or the South China Sea. That presence, that naval presence, and also approval and advocacy of training exercises, that's all still happening. And then, of course, security assistance. We've already talked about Ukraine, we've talked about Israel, and of course, we're talking about Taiwan today. Those are three significant, deep commitments that the administration is still carrying forward, but also Congress is pushing.
Yeah.
So Congress has a significant role here, and if anything, where Congress maybe deserves some criticism of not being as active with using their Article 2 powers, they have been consistent on support to Ukraine, support to Israel, support to Taiwan.
I want to thank you so much for explaining to our audience how the U.S. commitment to Taiwan appears to continue to be there. So thank you, Clark. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching DC Insiders. Please follow us on social media to get the latest episode. See you next time.